I was told that the ride on the Radha Damodar bus was Prabhupada's long-cherished dream. And because the vehicle that we had just repaired was in such first-class shape, we were informed that our bus would be used to take Srila Prabhupada, and that I would be the driver, and Mahamuni would be the servant, and Sunanda would be the cook. Now, Prabhu, I was an expert bus driver, expert. I could pull that bus into any spot, eyes closed. Somehow or other, when Prabhupada and all these sannyasis and senior devotees got on the bus, I was like terrified. I was like really hyperly nervous, you know? So we go out of the Lincoln Tunnel. Now, you know, it's a huge curb. And the curb itself, it has a really high cement curb. And somehow or other, the wheel itself, it gets stuck on the curb. I can't turn it to get it off. So the curb is guiding the whole bus. And sparks are flying out. Nobody, no one knows but me, right? And I'm just praying. I said, Krishna, why are you doing this to me now? I'm going to kill my guru, sannyasis, the deities. We're all going to go tumble. I said, kill me anytime, any way you want. Please don't. Prabhu, I have never, ever, ever experienced fear, anxiety, suffering like that. So I was just praying, trying to hold the bus so that the wheel would veer off to the left. And finally, after about 2 minutes of that, just intense, you know, 2 minutes was like an eternity, a few eternities. So finally the bus pulls away. Definitely some of my life force was dropped on that curb coming out of Lincoln Tunnel.
Srila Prabhupada had been standing looking at the wonderful fields. The devotees were gathered around. There were two fellows who were new devotees, very enthusiastic. They were country boys from not too far away. And they had brought from their own garden a medium-sized basket full of vegetables. And Srila Prabhupada picked up an eggplant out of the basket, and he just held it in his hand as though it were a jewel of some sort. And he held it kind of up and just looked at it. It had a real value, this produce. You can just tell his pleasure was immense. So at some point he spoke about how we should be able to feed the neighboring city temples, supply them with very luscious kinds of fresh foods like this. But not only that, but in time of need, we should be prepared to also produce an abundance sufficient to feed people living in a 10-mile radius.
Prabhupada took a walking tour of the barn and the machine area, and Paramananda was a little bit apologetic because Prabhupada had been to New Talavan a few months ago and chastised them for having farm equipment. But actually they had farm equipment and was standing outside in the weather getting rusty. And at Gita Nagari we had a lot of farm equipment, but everything was very well protected. But Paramananda was very much self-conscious. So as he was showing Prabhupada the different equipment, he was saying, and this is a disc and it'll do the work of so many men, and this is a plow and it'll do the work of so many men. And Prabhupada was very silent. But when Prabhupada gave his class later on that evening, he said, it's not that we hate machinery, everything can be used in Krishna's service. He also very much caught our mood that we didn't want to be in the cities. And so when Prabhupada noted that, he commented in his class, it's not that we hate the towns and villages, everything belongs to Krishna. So he saw our mentality and he cut through it very effectively.
When we picked up Prabhupada in the airport in New York, I was in the car following Tamal, Adikeshava, Rameshwar. Were in the car with Prabhupada. And they wanted to show Prabhupada where the temple was in relationship to all the other prestigious buildings in New York. So we went up Park Avenue, around Grand Central Station, and the Seagram's building where my father worked. And my father had been one of the guarantors for the temple. He'd spoken up as like a character reference for us to get this building. So as they drove by the Seagram's building, which itself was an architectural landmark, the first all-glass skyscraper in New York, they pointed out, oh, Prabhupada, look, That's Dristadumna Swami's father's building, the biggest liquor company in the world. And Prabhupada, liquor? Hiranyakashipu. But his son is like Prahlad.
My husband, Chaitanya Sima, he had been working on the building of the LA temple, and then it was finished. And then one day Srila Prabhupada called him up to his quarters, and he said, I've just received a call that we've just purchased a 13-story building in New York. And he was explaining to my husband that it was an old nursing home, and it was just a very old, broken down building. And the whole bottom floor needed to be gutted and made into a temple room. And all the floors had to be repainted and scraped and sanded. And it was just a tremendous amount of work. And he was asking my husband how long that would take. So my husband was just working it all out. And he was about to open his mouth to say, possibly we could do it within a year. But just before he got that out, Srila Prabhupada looked at him and smiled. And he said, I'm due to be in New York in 6 weeks. And the next thing I knew, my husband came home and said, Pack, we're moving to New York in the morning. And we did. And we started work immediately. And honestly, in the 6 weeks, I don't remember sleeping. I guess we must have. It was a 24-hour marathon for 6 weeks. And we did it. I don't know how it manifested, only by Prabhupada's mercy. But then there's a sweet little end to this, is when Srila Prabhupada was arriving, we were lining the walk from the front door to the car, and everybody was standing there with beautiful gifts and so many things to offer to Srila Prabhupada. And then I saw my husband come rushing out from doing the last minute things, and I could see him looking. Everybody had something to give Srila Prabhupada, and he felt he had nothing. So he rushed back in, and he went into the Pujari area, the flower room, but every last flower had been used, and all he could find was one rose, kind of dead and blackened. So he just grabbed it and ran back out, and he was holding that. And then Srila Prabhupada came out of his car, and he just kind of floated along, swan-like, you know. And everyone was giving him gifts, and his arms would pile up, and then he'd hand them back to his servant. And then my husband was watching all these gifts, and finally he just put this old rotten rose behind his back. And Srila Prabhupada was just looking straight ahead the whole time. And then he came to my husband, and he just stopped. And he held his hand out. And my husband didn't do anything for a minute, and Prabhupada moved his hand, like, give it to me. And so he brought this old wilted rose out from behind his back and put it in Srila Prabhupada's hand. And Prabhupada held the rose between his two hands in a pranam and turned to my husband and said, thank you very much. He is just such an amazing soul. The most wonderful thing about Srila Prabhupada is he just knew everything. He just knew your heart.
Regarding the Rath Yatra, Srila Prabhupada actually asked, how is it possible you got the permit? Because he was aware that it was very difficult to get a permit on Fifth Avenue. As a matter of fact, it was technically against the law because there was an edict by the mayor that said no new parades since 1962. So he asked, how did you do it anyways? And so I thought I would tell him something since he's asking. It was ultimately his mercy, his pastime. So I simply said, well, Srila Prabhupada, on the application, I said, 3 hand-pulled carts. And so Srila Prabhupada laughed and he said, yes, this is in our line. Just like Vamanadev, he only asked for 3 steps of land. Of course, what's always amazing about Srila Prabhupada's quips is they're so full of spiritual realization and knowledge, and they're so spontaneous and so quick. Yes, that is in our line. So wonderful.
New York Rath Yatra was really a momentous event. It was a great triumph, the one I filmed. I'm from New York City, and I went to high school near the Plaza Hotel, where Rath Yatra to this day still begins there. And so the Upper East Side was where I grew up. And I knew the significance of the Rath Yatra festival going down Fifth Avenue. I really understood what that meant. And I reflected on how much it meant to Srila Prabhupada because he started in New York City, and New York City I knew meant a lot to Prabhupada because it's the most important city in the world, and I think Prabhupada knew if he could establish himself in New York, then that was a good thing. And for me, having the Rath Yatra Festival go down Fifth Avenue with Srila Prabhupada in the chariots was one of the most triumphant moments in the history of ISKCON, because New York is the Big Apple, and in a way the whole world watches everything that was going on there. And sure enough, the next day in the New York Times on the front page was a picture of the Rath Yatra chariot going down Fifth Avenue. And I was so proud because I knew Srila Prabhupada would see that. It described the Rath Yatra procession with Prabhupada in very sober and positive terms.
Parading down Fifth Avenue with Lord Jagannath was the fulfillment of really a lifelong ambition. I was sitting with Prabhupada once in Mayapur, and he just turned to me and he said, "When I was a young boy, I wanted to perform Rath Yatra. And so my father got me a Rath Yatra cart." And Prabhupada was looking at me like he was about a 6 or 8 year old boy. And he said, everybody thought it was just a play, Rath Yatra. Then he touched me like this with his hand. He said, "But it was real. It was real." He said, "I used to go to sleep in my bed with the Rath cart next to me. In the night I would wake up and reach out to make sure that it was there." He said, "In this way, from my childhood, I was performing Rath Yatra in a small way, and now I'm doing it in a big way all over the world." His ambition as a young boy is to take the train from Calcutta to Puri, that he could go to the Rath Yatra in Jagannath Puri. What an ambition for a child. Such a pure ambition on his part that Lord Jagannath fulfilled it in such a grand style.
1976, after Mayapur, Tamal Krishnaraj and I went to New York to get help from my father to be able to get into China, because China was closed. Madame Mao was in power and her gang of 4, and it was terribly xenophobic. No Westerners were allowed in except under special circumstances. So through my father's contacts, we were able to get IDs as like spiritual sky incense representatives going to look for incense punk. So in New York, we got Brooks Brothers suits. We started to grow our hair. The party was now under Madhavisa. It was the GBC of Radha Damodar, New York, and Gita inaugurated. They'd merged into one huge party. And Adikeshava was the president there in New York. So we had a room there, we did our thing, and we got prepared, and we were en route to Hong Kong via Hawaii, where Prabhupada was writing his 8th canto, the story of Gajendra. And at that time, 2 things happened simultaneously. One, he didn't approve of us going to China anymore because he considered it a waste of time under those conditions. There wouldn't be any possibility for preaching. And secondly, that Madhavisa had disappeared, given up his sannyas. So Prabhupada said, "So you go back and take up your party," which was the last thing we ever expected to hear from Prabhupada, given the intensity of the emotions just 2 months earlier in Mayapur. So that was a big shock. Prabhupada said, "So now you go back and take up your party, but one thing you must learn, you cannot force." So there was some discussions then about sannyas. Prabhupada said, "Actually, I have not given any of you sannyas, but I am in a war with Maya, material energy, and I need leaders." He said, "It is called in wartime battlefield commission. There are no qualified leaders, but someone has to lead the charge. So you take, okay, every 5th man, you're now lieutenant of the squad." He's really a private, but we make him lieutenant for the day. And he leads the charge. And then Prabhupada said, "It is to be understood that you are not sufficiently equipped for this fight, and most of you will go down." And I know what he means now that I'm older. We knew very little but we were enthusiastic. So we show back up in New York, having never gone to China, and Prabhupada's coming. So Tamal and Adi Keshav asked, would I manage the Rath Yatra overall? So I did. And it was wonderful working with Jayananda. I'll never forget that.
The parade had already traveled about a mile from Central Park, and it was headed toward Washington Square Park at the end of Fifth Avenue. Srila Prabhupada stepped up onto the Subhadra cart at 34th Street, and the police who were overseeing the parade took note, and they told me later, said that man was really special. And they ended up volunteering, the same group, every year for that duty, because they actually took some thrill in the occasion. It was a voluntary task. Obviously, there was some compensation, but they took interest and they looked forward to participating themselves in the Rath Yatra. Rath Yatra parade was going down Fifth Avenue, and we drove down parallel, maybe down Sixth Avenue, and we crossed a couple of blocks, and we saw, like on one cross street, one of the Rath carts, and then when we got down to the next cross street, there was the other one. So it stretched the whole city block, and it looked really impressive from where we were. And then we cut across to the cross street where the Empire State Building is. Then we waited there for a few minutes for the Rath cart. We were a little bit ahead, and then the Rath carts came down, and then they stopped just where we were, and then Prabhupada got out. But I remember there was this tremendous scrummage. There was all reporters, newspapers and TV and what have you, and they were all, I mean, literally, there were one or two of them were fighting with each other to get in because everybody was so packed up, and the devotees were all around chanting and dancing like crazy when Prabhupada came out. Prabhupada just kind of glided through the whole thing. So you see Prabhupada bumped his head on the decking, it was so low. So they were a little paranoid that, some crazy people might try to do something. So it was a security measure. We also sat with him under the decking, and there was about 3 or 4 devotees that were sat on the corners and next to the Vyasasan. And I found out later that they were all armed. They all had guns on them. I think the deprogramming stuff had just started up in America, and there'd been demonstrations in LA in early June, so they were a little bit afraid of that. So from our vantage point, we really didn't see very much. We were underneath the decking there. All we could see was lots and lots of people up and down the streets. Prabhupada really enjoyed it because it was exactly 10 years to the month, when he had formed ISKCON in New York in that little tiny storefront with just a small group, 5 or 10 hippies. And now he's back in New York, gliding down Fifth Avenue with these massive Rath carts, hundreds and thousands of people watching. Prabhupada said it was like a dream come true.
I had lived with Jayananda for 2 years in San Francisco, so we were very close. He was in preparation like normal, doing everything himself, superhuman effort to prepare the carts for the festival. So I came up the elevator in that skyscraper building, and I came around the corner, and there was a bathroom down that hallway, and I saw Jayananda, and he was walking with his torso parallel to the ground, literally. And I yelled out, "Jayananda!" And then he went running down the corridor. And before he got to his room, I came in front of him and I said, "Jayananda, what's going on with your body, with your health? What is it?" And he looked at me, put his hands on both my shoulders, and he said, "All right, I'll tell you something, but you've got to promise me one thing, that you won't say anything until after the Rath Yatra." And I said, "Okay, Jayananda, I won't say anything, please." And then he lifted up his arm, and underneath his armpit there were huge lumps. And then he lifted up his other arm, His other arm was the same, these huge lumps.